Welcome back to Quest for Truth. As we enter this Christmas season, let's just take a minute to look at the broad background of Jesus coming on earth that we celebrate at Christmas time. So when you go back right to the beginning, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God creates the world, he creates the universe, then he creates the world, and he prepares it specifically for man, with the land, with the animals, with the plants, and then he puts man into the Garden of Eden. And then Genesis chapter 3, man sins and is cast out of the garden, and the whole earth begins to groan. And then in Genesis 3:15 we see the first gospel, which is that even though that man has sinned, God will send a seed of the woman, Eve, who will be born, who will defeat Satan ultimately. And we see that throughout all of Scripture. We see the Messiah being prophesied about as it continues to get closer and closer to the time of his coming. There's more and more information being given that points directly to Jesus. And I'm not going to look at any of that specifically today, but that's kind of the thing. And one of the things that's really been something that's interested me is that this line, right? You have Adam and Eve, and then you have Seth, and then it continues down the line to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then you have Judah, and all the way down and through David, and everything that happens. There's so much war and so many people who fall away who are disciplined by God, and yet this line is still protected by God throughout history, that the Messiah would be born the way that the prophecy says that it will be. And all of these prophecies are fulfilled through, at least the prophecies that are about his first coming are fulfilled through his first coming. But there's one aspect of his first coming, and really his second coming as well, but we'll get to that in a minute, that is really mostly absent from prophecy, and that is when it will come. So there's a lot about where, there's a lot about who. We know that, like I said, through the ancestral line, we know where, right? We know he was born in Bethlehem. We know that he would be raised in Nazareth, but when is a question that isn't really answered. There's one verse, I believe, that touches upon it in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25 through 27. It says, "So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in the times of the distress." And so we see that the one timeline piece that kind of denotes when Jesus would come is the temple. And this in Daniel is written before Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt, but soon after that it was rebuilt, the second temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so there's a time frame there between when Daniel was written, soon after that, and 70 AD of when the Messiah would come. So we kind of have a broad aspect, so we know that he must have already come, but that's the only verse that really talks about when he would come, and there's no clear knowledge there that the temple would be destroyed again in a more recent time. And so that's an interesting piece, I think, because, like I said before, it also equates to Jesus' second coming. And so we know a few things about his second coming. I mean, we have, before the second coming, there's the rapture, right? The rapture before the second coming is the tribulation, right? And so we know, kind of in relation to other aspects of the end times. We kind of know when, but we don't know when this will all kick off. But we do know that we do know where. We know he'll return to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, where he left from. But there's an interesting verse, I think, that kind of brings, it's talking about the second coming specifically, but I think even when we think about Christmas along with the second coming as well, this kind of brings a certain kind of knowledge to it. And so Galatians 4:4-5, but when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, and that we might receive the adoption as sons. And I think I messed up there. I said it was about the second. It's about his first coming, right? But we still see, it gives us kind of so we see that it's the fullness of time. And you've probably heard that phrase before. It's a pretty common one of when Jesus came the first time, of, people talk about Rome being the great empire, kind of uniting, in a sense, a large mass of the known world. And like the Roman roads and all of that, where the church grew rapidly because they had things like, they were very advanced writing, and Koine Greek was very understandable to the average people. And so you have like that kind of time where it was like sort of the perfect timing. But like it said, it was the fullness of time, and that was God's timing. It came exactly when God wanted Jesus to come. He sent forth his Son. So it wasn't like, oh, that's just when it happened. No, it was God sent forth his Son at the time that he wanted it to happen. And as we think about Christmas, it's important to remember that not only did he come once, but like I've said, he's going to come again, and no one knows the day or the hour. And so when we think about his second coming, well, I think it's really the same kind of idea of when the fullness of time is, that Jesus will return. And I think that Christmas, when we think about Christmas in general, I think it should be not just remembering, looking back to Jesus in the manger, but looking ahead to Christ's return. And when he returns, the church, right, will be taken up to heaven for a short time, the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? And then we'll all come back down to earth to reign with him. And so I think it's important to keep that entire picture in mind when we look at Christmas, not just the birth of Jesus, but really you have the birth, you have the crucifixion, which I haven't really mentioned, but we'll also talk about that in the next few weeks. And then the eternal reign of Christ, and the church with him. And as we think about the second coming of Christ, one of the passages that I've already alluded to part of it here, but it's in Matthew chapter 24. It starts in verse 36 and says, But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And there's that idea that everything is going kind of just the day-to-day routines. Everybody's going about their lives, being married, given in marriage, right? Eating, drinking, doing the things that you normally do. And then all of a sudden, it happens. And that's talking about the rapture here, I believe. And so that day, no one knows, right? It's when the fullness of time comes, like with the first coming, the fullness of time is when the rapture will happen. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind as we look at this season of Christmas coming ahead that Jesus will return for his church. So that's, I think, a very great encouragement to remember that we're here carrying out the Father's mission. We're here to spread the gospel, but there will be an end to it, and Christ will return one day, and we'll be with him forever. And it's also important to remember that the time is short, right? To remember that there's only a certain number of time that we have here on earth. So, like Jesus said, he's always about his Father's business, and that's something that should remind us that we should be continually about God's mission. Not that we can't take a day off or anything, or to rest, but that we should always be looking for how to serve God. And I think that it's a big difference from how the culture celebrates Christmas. To the culture, it's what can I get out of it? But to the Christian, it's we look back on what we got really, that we celebrate at Christmas, which is the birth of Jesus, the incarnation of deity into a body of flesh. But then we look forward also to what we did get through the crucifixion of Christ, that we are redeemed in his sight. And then we look and say, now what can I do because of that, right? Because we love God, what can we do to obey him? And so I think being a Christian means being countercultural, especially when it comes to Christmas time. Not that the festivities are wrong, but that we should really understand that the meaning of Christmas isn't just, we often say Jesus is the reason for the season, right? But it's not just that. It's about what can we actually do to show Jesus to the world. And in the next few weeks, we're just going to be looking at Jesus and kind of connecting through this time of how, from the beginning to the end of the story, how who Jesus is, and then how we fit into that, and how we are on this earth, and then how we are into eternity. And so I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you join me for the next few weeks as we look into this. And I'll see you next week as we start off our Christmas series.